When 32-year-old Daisy Moore was handed the rusty keys to the Ashbourne estate, her wealthy cousins secretly toasted to her ruin. They had successfully dumped a crumbling, debt-ridden nightmare onto the poorest member of the family. They thought they had won. They didn't know what was hiding inside the walls. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Thomas Gable's downtown Boston law office, casting long, weeping shadows across the heavy mahogany conference table. Daisy sat near the edge of her leather chair, her damp trench coat folded awkwardly in her lap. Across from her sat her cousins Roland and Cynthia Montgomery. They looked perfectly untouched by the miserable New England weather. Roland was casually adjusting the cuffs of a tailored Brioni suit, while Cynthia scrolled through her phone, her blonde hair perfectly blown out, a faint scent of expensive gardenia perfume wafting over the table. They were here for the reading of Great Uncle Harrison Pendleton's will. Daisy hadn't expected anything. Since her mother passed away 3 years ago, after a brutal, drawn-out battle with illness, Daisy had been drowning. She worked 50 hours a week as a mid-level corporate accountant, yet her entire salary vanished into the black hole of medical debts and the predatory interest rates of personal loans she had taken out to keep her mother comfortable. She was exhausted, living off cheap coffee and sheer anxiety. Thomas Gable, a man whose face seemed composed entirely of wrinkles and legal caution, cleared his throat. As you know, Harrison's estate is somewhat complicated. While the liquid assets and the commercial properties in Manhattan are straightforward, there is the matter of the Ashbourne property in Connecticut. Roland leaned forward, clasping his manicured hands together. A look of profound, entirely fabricated sympathy washed over his face. Daisy, Cynthia, and I were talking before you arrived. We know how much you loved Uncle Harrison, and we know how fond you were of that old house when we were kids. Daisy blinked, caught off guard. Ashbourne, I haven't been there since I was 10. I remember it being beautiful, but it's a historical gem. Cynthia interrupted, her tone dripping with saccharine sweetness. Roland and I already have our homes. We have our trust funds. It frankly feels incredibly greedy for us to split the estate 3 ways and liquidate a piece of family history. We want you to have it, Daisy. Entirely. Daisy looked between them, her heart giving a sudden, treacherous leap. Ashbourne was a sprawling 3-story Victorian manor, situated on 12 acres of heavily wooded land. Even as a child, she remembered the grand oak staircase, the wraparound porch, the stained glass transoms. If she owned a house like that, free and clear, it could change her life. She could sell it, pay off her mother's medical debt, and finally breathe. "You want me to take the house?" Daisy asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What about the rest of the estate?" Roland smiled, a tight, practiced expression. "We'll take the Manhattan properties and the stock portfolios. It's a burden managing commercial real estate, but we're willing to shoulder it so you can have a real home. A legacy." Thomas Gable pushed a thick stack of papers across the desk. He didn't look Daisy in the eye. "If you agree to these terms, Miss Moore, you will sign a quit-claim deed, relinquishing your rights to the liquid assets and commercial properties in exchange for sole ownership of the Ashbourne estate and its associated grounds." It felt too good to be true, but the exhaustion in Daisy's bones urged her to sign. The thought of fighting her billionaire cousins in probate court for years was nauseating. With a shaky hand, she took the heavy Mont Blanc pen Gable offered and signed her name. Roland and Cynthia exchanged a fleeting glance. It was barely a fraction of a second, but Daisy caught it. It was a look of profound, mocking triumph. 2 days later, Daisy understood why. Her 2011 Honda Civic sputtered as she turned off the main highway and onto the winding, overgrown driveway of the Ashbourne estate. The rhododendrons had grown into monstrous, untamed walls of green, scraping against the sides of her car. When the house finally came into view, Daisy slammed on the brakes, the air rushing out of her lungs in a sharp gasp. This was not the grand palace of her childhood memories. It was a rotting corpse of a building. The roof sagged heavily in the middle, missing hundreds of shingles like knocked-out teeth. The wraparound porch, once a gleaming white, was a terrifying hazard of collapsed termite-eaten wood. Ivy had crawled up the brickwork, prying the mortar apart, and half the windows were boarded up with greying plywood. Daisy stepped out into the damp, overgrown grass, panic rising in her throat. She unlocked the heavy front door, throwing her shoulder against the swollen wood to force it open. The smell hit her instantly, a heavy, suffocating stench of mildew-wet decay and animal droppings. The grand oak staircase was scarred and water-damaged. The beautiful stained-glass windows were cracked, letting in harsh, fractured light that illuminated the dust swirling in the air. But the physical decay wasn't the worst part. Waiting for her on the dusty foyer table was a thick manila envelope forwarded by Thomas Gable's office. Daisy tore it open. Inside was a letter from the county tax assessor, along with a report from a structural engineer. Ashbourne wasn't just falling apart. It had $85,000 in back taxes attached to the deed, a lien that she had legally assumed the moment she signed the papers in Gable's office. Furthermore, the property had been condemned by the town. To even put it on the market, she would legally have to complete an estimated $200,000 in structural reinforcements to clear the safety violations. She collapsed onto the bottom step of the staircase, the dust billowing up around her jeans. She had been played. Roland and Cynthia hadn't given her a legacy. They had handed her an anchor. They knew the property was unsellable without a massive cash injection, and they knew the town was threatening to seize it. By giving it to Daisy, they avoided the tax liability and the demolition costs, neatly passing the financial ruin on to her, while walking away with millions in clean liquid assets. Daisy buried her face in her hands and cried. She cried for her mother, for her empty bank account, and for her own foolish, trusting nature. The house creaked around her, a slow, agonizing groan of settling wood, as if laughing at the trap she had walked blindly into. For a week, Daisy lived in a state of numb survival. She couldn't afford to walk away, because the county would eventually come after her personal wages for the tax debt. She couldn't afford to hire contractors. Her only option was a desperate, borderline insane plan. She would try to stabilize the house herself, clear the most egregious code violations using cheap materials, and beg the county for a forbearance so she could sell the land to a developer for a fraction of its worth. It was a terrible plan, but it was all she had. She took a leave of absence from her accounting firm, drained the last $2,000 from her savings, and went to the local hardware store. She bought crowbars, sledgehammers, heavy-duty trash bags, contractor masks, and a cheap sleeping bag. She set up a makeshift camp in what used to be the main parlor, as it was the only room on the ground floor where the ceiling didn't look ready to cave in. The nights were terrifying. The house was a symphony of unsettling noises, rats scuttling in the walls, the wind howling through the cracks, and the constant rhythmic drip of water from the leaking roof. On her fourth morning, shivering in 2 layers of sweaters, Daisy decided to tackle the ruined plaster in the parlor. The structural engineer's report noted that the load-bearing beams behind the east wall needed to be inspected for rot, which meant tearing out the 120-year-old lath and plaster. Armed with a crowbar and wearing a respirator mask, Daisy approached the wall. It was covered in peeling, hideous yellow wallpaper that felt slimy to the touch. She drove the flat edge of the crowbar into the wall and pulled back. With a sickening crunch, a large chunk of plaster came away, raining a century's worth of black dust onto the floorboards. Daisy coughed, waving her hands to clear the air. She swung the crowbar again, harder this time, letting out a frustrated scream that echoed through the empty mansion. She was smashing Roland's smug face. She was smashing Cynthia's fake pity. She hacked away for an hour, sweat pouring down her face, despite the chill in the air, until she had exposed a large section of the wooden laths beneath. She took the claw of the hammer and began ripping the thin strips of wood away to expose the hollow cavity between the interior and exterior walls. As she pulled away a particularly stubborn piece of wood, she noticed something strange. The cavity between the heavy oak framing wasn't empty, and it wasn't filled with the usual dead mice or old insulation. Stuffed tightly between the vertical studs about waist-high was a rectangular object wrapped in thick, dark, oiled canvas. It was bound tightly with heavy twine and covered in decades of dust and cobwebs. Daisy froze her hammer, suspended in mid-air. Her heart began to thud heavily against her ribs. She set the tools down and reached into the dark, jagged hole she had created. Her fingers brushed against the canvas. It was heavy, much heavier than she expected. Carefully scraping her knuckles against the rough nails in the wood, she wiggled the package free. It was roughly the size of a large shoebox. She carried it over to her sleeping bag, laying it down on the floorboards. She pulled a utility knife from her pocket and sliced through the rotting twine. The canvas was stiff and crackled as she peeled it back. Inside the canvas was a layer of thick, yellowed wax paper meant to keep out moisture. Daisy peeled the wax paper back. She stopped breathing. Stacked neatly inside were bundles of paper currency, but it wasn't modern money. Daisy reached out with trembling fingers and picked up the top bundle. The bills were slightly larger than the money she was used to, printed in a vibrant, deep green and striking gold. She stared at the face of Grover Cleveland. Across the top, bold letters read, "Gold Certificate." In the corners, the number was undeniable. $1,000. And it wasn't just one bill. It was a stack bound by a brittle paper strap. Beneath it was another stack of $500 bills featuring William McKinley. And beneath that stacks of perfectly preserved, uncirculated $100 bills. Daisy's mind, trained as an accountant, instantly began to calculate the impossible. Just in the top layer alone, there had to be over $50,000 in face value. But as a collector's item, vintage uncirculated gold certificates from the 1920s. The value was astronomical. Millions. Oh my God, Daisy whispered the sound, swallowed by the vast, empty room. Oh my God. At the bottom of the package, beneath the final layer of cash, lay a small, leather-bound ledger. The leather was dry and cracking. Daisy gently opened it. The handwriting inside was an elegant, looping cursive written in faded fountain pen ink. October 14th, 1929. The market has fallen. They call us fools, but I saw the panic coming. I have liquidated the Chicago accounts. The banks are failing, but the walls of Ashbourne will hold our fortune secure. No one will think to look behind the wainscoting. I have dispersed the assets across 7 caches on the ground floor to prevent total loss in the event of fire. The signature at the bottom made Daisy's breath hitch. Elias Pendleton. Elias Pendleton was her great-grandfather. He was a man family law had always painted as a disgraced businessman who lost the family fortune during the Great Depression. But the law was wrong. He hadn't lost the fortune. He had hidden it. Daisy looked up at the massive walls of the parlor, then toward the grand hallway, the dining room and the library. 7 caches. She had only found one. She was sitting in the middle of a gold mine. Roland and Cynthia hadn't tricked her into taking a liability. They had inadvertently handed her the lost Pendleton fortune. A sudden sharp sound shattered the silence. It was the crunch of tires on gravel outside. Daisy scrambled to her feet, her heart leaping into her throat. She ran to the grimy front window and peered through a crack in the plywood. A sleek silver Mercedes-Benz G-Class SUV was slowly pulling to a stop in the driveway. The driver's side door opened, and a pair of expensive leather Italian loafers stepped out into the mud. It was Roland. He was supposed to be in Manhattan. Why was he here a week after the inheritance, showing up unannounced at an abandoned house he supposedly couldn't wait to be rid of? Daisy looked frantically at the open hole in the wall, the exposed lath, and the fortune in cash sitting openly on her sleeping bag. Roland was walking up the decaying front steps. "Daisy!" Roland's voice boomed through the front door, accompanied by 3 sharp knocks. "Daisy, it's Roland. Open up. We need to talk about the property." Daisy grabbed the canvas, threw the stacks of ancient bills and the ledger back inside, and frantically shoved the bundle under her heavy sleeping bag. She kicked a pile of plaster dust and broken wood over the exposed hole in the wall just as the front doorknob began to rattle. She took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to slow her racing heart. The game had completely changed, but if Roland suspected for a single second what she had just found, he would unleash an army of lawyers to rip Ashbourne away from her. She had to play the part of the defeated, broken cousin. She had to lie. "Coming!" Daisy yelled, wiping the dust from her face and marching toward the door. Daisy pulled open the heavy, swollen front door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She kept her body angled, blocking as much of the foyer and the parlor behind her as possible. Roland stood on the decaying porch, wearing a cashmere overcoat that looked absurdly out of place against the backdrop of peeling paint and rotting wood. He held a sleek leather briefcase. The fake sympathetic smile was back, plastered across his face. "Daisy," he said, letting out a heavy, dramatic sigh as he took in her dust-covered clothes and the respirator mask hanging around her neck. "Look at you. This is exactly what Cynthia and I feared. This house is a death trap." "What are you doing here, Roland?" Daisy kept her voice deliberately flat, trying to mask the adrenaline trembling through her limbs. "I thought you and Cynthia were busy liquidating the Manhattan assets." Roland shifted his weight, his eyes darting over Daisy's shoulder, trying to peer into the shadowy depths of the house. "I came because I feel terribly guilty. We spoke with Thomas Gable again yesterday. The town is moving faster than we anticipated on the demolition order. If you don't clear those violations by the end of the month, they won't just seize the property, they'll garnish your wages to pay for the wrecking ball." It was a lie. Daisy had spoken to the county clerk 3 days ago. She had a 6-month grace period. "I'm handling it," Daisy said tightly. "Daisy, be reasonable." Roland pressed, taking a step forward. Daisy didn't budge. "You're living in a biohazard. I was going through Uncle Harrison's private safe in the city yesterday, organizing his personal papers, and I realized just how deep the financial hole is here. I can't let you ruin your life. I've drafted a new contract." He tapped the briefcase. "I will personally buy the estate back from you for $10,000. It gives you a fresh start, and I'll absorb the debt. It's the right thing to do." Daisy's mind raced. Roland Montgomery wouldn't cross the street to save a drowning man if it cost him $1. If he was offering her $10,000 and willing to take on $200,000 in structural repairs and tax liens, he wasn't doing it out of charity. He had found something in Harrison's safe. A letter? A clue. He knew about Elias Pendleton's hidden caches. $10,000? Daisy asked, feigning a weary, broken sigh. She looked down at her dirty boots. "Roland, I just need a few days. I've already started pulling down the plaster. Let me see if I can salvage the oak framing. If I can't, I'll sign." Roland's jaw tightened. A flash of genuine panic crossed his eyes. "You're pulling down the walls, Daisy. You don't know what you're doing. You could hit a load-bearing stud. Let me come inside. Let me look at what you've done." No, Daisy said, perhaps a little too sharply. She caught herself and softened her tone, bringing a hand to her forehead. I'm sorry. I'm just so tired and I'm covered in filth. Give me until Friday. Please, just let me have until Friday to say goodbye to the place properly. Roland stared at her, his eyes cold and calculating. He clearly wanted to push past her, but Daisy was standing her ground, and legally he was trespassing on her property. Friday. Roland finally agreed, his voice losing all its faux warmth. I'll be back at noon. Do not tear down any more of this house, Daisy. It's dangerous. He turned on his heel, marched down the steps, and climbed into his Mercedes. Daisy waited until the silver SUV disappeared down the overgrown driveway before she slammed the door and locked the deadbolt. She didn't have until Friday. She had to find the rest of the caches immediately. If Roland brought Gable back with a court order, claiming she was mentally unfit or destroying historical property, they could lock her out. Daisy sprinted back to the parlor. She grabbed the crowbar and the hammer. Elias's ledger had mentioned 7 caches on the ground floor. She had one. She ran into the formal dining room. The wainscoting here was made of dark, heavy mahogany. Daisy bypassed the elegant paneling and looked for anomalies. She remembered the entry in the ledger to prevent total loss in the event of fire. He would have placed them near brick or stone. She moved to the massive stone fireplace. The woodwork surrounding the mantel sounded hollow when she tapped it with the handle of her hammer. She jammed the crowbar into the seam and pulled with all her strength. The wood splintered and gave way with a loud crack. There, resting on the brick shelf behind the woodwork, was another oiled canvas bundle. Daisy pulled it out. This one was heavier. She ripped it open to find not paper money but heavy velvet bags. She loosened the drawstring of the first bag and poured a handful of heavy metal into her palm. They were solid gold coins. Double eagles. 1920s mint. She laughed, a breathless, hysterical sound that echoed off the high ceilings. For the next 48 hours, Daisy didn't sleep. Fueled by adrenaline tap water and the sheer intoxicating thrill of survival, she systematically dismantled the walls of the Ashbourne estate. She found the 3rd cache in the library, hidden beneath a false floorboard under the radiator. It contained bundles of Series 1928 $500 bills. The 4th and 5th caches were concealed within the hollow pillars framing the entrance to the solarium. They yielded tightly rolled bearer bonds, perfectly preserved in wax-sealed glass jars, alongside more gold certificates. By Thursday night, her hands were blistered and bleeding, her muscles screaming in agony. The grand ground floor of Ashbourne looked like a war zone of shattered plaster, ripped wood, and dust. But sitting in the center of her sleeping bag, illuminated by a single battery-powered camping lantern, were all 7 canvas bundles. Daisy sat cross-legged, staring at the unimaginable wealth piled before her. She had roughly estimated the face value of the currency and the melt value of the gold. But the collector's value, she knew it had to be in the tens of millions. Now she had to prepare for war. Roland was coming back at noon, and he wasn't going to take no for an answer. At 8 a.m. on Friday, Daisy sat in the leather passenger seat of a rented armored transit van parked behind Ashbourne. Beside her sat Arthur Sterling, no Arthur Penhaligon, an elite independent asset manager and legal shark she had found through a frantic midnight search of high-net-worth legal firms in Boston. Arthur was a man who looked like he had been born wearing a 3-piece suit. He was currently staring at one of the 1928 gold certificates under a jeweler's loupe, his usually stoic expression entirely shattered. "Miss Moore," Arthur whispered, lowering the loupe, "I have been in asset management for 35 years. I have never seen a private hoard of this magnitude. The numismatic market will lose its mind over these double eagles. You are looking at a minimum a minimum of $40 million at auction. Daisy exhaled a shaky breath, handing Arthur the deed and the quitclaim document Gable had prepared. "Are you absolutely certain they can't touch it? My cousins are ruthless. They will claim the money belongs to the estate, not to me." Arthur adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and read over the quitclaim deed. Suddenly, a sharp, delighted chuckle escaped his lips. "Oh, this is brilliant. Their own malice has completely destroyed them." "What do you mean?" Daisy asked. Arthur tapped a heavily paragraphed section of the contract. "Your cousins and their lawyer used an aggressive airtight liability shield to ensure you could never sue them for the condition of the house. In doing so, they explicitly forfeited all rights to the property. It says right here, the grantee assumes ownership of the Ashbourne parcel in its entirety, including all structures, fixtures, chattels, and any all discovered or hidden assets located on the premises, known or unknown, absolving the grantors of any claim." Arthur looked up, grinning like a wolf. "They wrote hidden assets to protect themselves in case you found toxic waste, buried oil tanks, or unpaid liens in the walls. Legally, they gave you this money, free and clear." At 11:55 a.m., the crunch of gravel signaled the arrival of Roland's Mercedes. This time, another car followed, a sleek, black town car. Daisy stood on the front porch. She had showered at a local motel, changed into a sharp navy blue blazer and clean jeans, and bandaged her hands. She did not look like the broken woman from 2 days ago. Behind her, Arthur Penhaligon stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 private security contractors in dark suits. The armored van containing the 7 caches had already safely departed for a private vault in Boston. Roland stepped out of his SUV. Cynthia stepped out of the passenger side, clutching a designer handbag, looking thoroughly disgusted by the mud on her heels. Thomas Gable emerged from the town car carrying a thick leather briefcase. They marched up the steps but stopped short when they saw the security guards and Arthur. "Daisy!" Roland demanded, his face flushing with anger. "What is the meaning of this? Who are these men?" "This is my attorney, Arthur Penhaligon," Daisy said calmly, stepping to the edge of the porch, looking down at her cousins. "And these men are my security. You're trespassing on my property, Roland." Cynthia scoffed, stepping forward. "Oh, don't be dramatic, Daisy. We know you can't afford this circus. Thomas has the paperwork. We're here to legally seize the property. Uncle Harrison's records indicated there might be historical artifacts left on the premises. They belong to the family trust." "You mean Elias Pendleton's 7 caches?" Daisy asked. Her voice was quiet, but it hit the cousins like a physical blow. Roland's face drained of color. He staggered back a half step. You found them." "I did." Daisy smiled, a cold, hard expression. "All 7. That money belongs to the estate." Roland roared, lunging forward, but the 2 security guards immediately stepped to the edge of the stairs, blocking his path. "Thomas, tell her. Tell her it's ours." Thomas Gable was frantically opening his briefcase, his hands trembling. "Miss Moore, any currency discovered on the property is part of Harrison Pendleton's liquid estate, which belongs to your cousins. You only own the real estate." Arthur Penhaligon stepped forward, withdrawing a crisp copy of the quitclaim deed from his coat pocket. He held it out. "I suggest you reread the contract you drafted, Mr. Gable. Page 4, Section 3. All discovered or hidden assets located on the premises, known or unknown. You were so eager to ensure Miss Moore couldn't sue you for asbestos or structural collapse that you legally signed over everything inside the house." Gable snatched the paper, his eyes frantically scanning the highlighted text. His face turned an ashen gray. He looked at Roland and slowly shook his head. "You incompetent fool!" Cynthia shrieked at Gable, her perfectly manicured facade crumbling into pure, ugly rage. She turned to Daisy, her eyes wide with desperation. "Daisy, please. That's our family legacy. You can't do this to us. We're blood." "You're right," Daisy said, leaning against the wooden porch railing. "We are blood. And when I was drowning in medical debt after Mom died, you didn't answer my calls. When you thought this house would ruin my life, you laughed while you handed me the keys." Daisy looked out over the overgrown lawn, feeling the cool Connecticut breeze on her face. The house behind her didn't feel like a rotting corpse anymore. It felt like a fortress. "You gave me a legacy, Roland," Daisy said, her voice echoing with finality. "And I'm keeping it. Now get off my land before I have you arrested for trespassing." Roland stood frozen, his hands balling into fists, realizing the horrifying truth. In their desperate, greedy attempt to bury their cousin, they had handed her a $40 million empire. Without another word, Daisy turned her back on them, walking through the grand oak doors of the Ashbourne estate, and quietly shut the door on her cousins forever. Greed will always dig its own grave, and for Daisy's cousins their trap became her ultimate triumph. Sometimes the burdens people try to push onto you are actually hidden blessings waiting to be uncovered. If you loved this story of karma and ultimate revenge, hit that like button. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable real-life dramas and hidden treasure stories.